a number of very detailed discussions about a range of issues going to the heart of the economic relationship between China and Australia, and also involving a number of issues relating to the G20, which Australia is the chair of at the moment. Chairman Xu opened by recognising, in his words, that the investment environment in Australia has improved a lot since the election of the coalition government. He also praised the government for its decision to repeal the carbon tax and the mining tax. He recognised that Australia has undertaken significant reform in its economy over a long period of time, and there is much information that we can share between Australia and China in order to help to facilitate major new opportunities for economic growth. In particular, we discussed the free trade agreement negotiations between Australia and China, which Minister Robb might care to add to. We discussed the target for growth in the G20, and we discussed closer financial relations, including Australia's desire to have a clearing bank for renminbi in Australia, and also the opportunity to create a market maker for renminbi trading in association with that clearing bank in Australia. Out of our discussions today, there was mutual recognition that there is tremendous opportunity to deepen the relationship at a number of levels, including in particular expanding services exports from Australia to China, and also improving investment opportunities. As a result of that, we have agreed to create an investment cooperation framework at the suggestion of Chairman Xu, who has asked us to work with him to create a much deeper framework for the improvement in investment in the relationship between China and Australia. The suggestion by Chairman Xu to go down this path illustrates a tremendous goodwill that the leadership of China has towards Australia, and in turn our strong support for deepening the investment relationship from China to Australia is recognised as contributing to an overall significant improvement in the overarching economic relationship. So it was a very productive few hours, and later today the Minister and I will be meeting with Vice Premier Zhong, and we'll seek to further build on a number of initiatives that were framed at our strategic economic dialogue. Andrew, do you want to add something? And then
well, just particularly on the free trade agreement discussions, which we had a considerable time going through that. I think the conclusion, well, I don't think, the conclusion was that it was doable this year, it could be completed, and that both governments are determined to bring it to completion later this year. Chairman Xu did suggest that the NDRC will be active in helping to conclude that free trade agreement. And I would say that the initiative that Chairman Xu put forward on the working group to develop an investment cooperation framework, the intent there is to have that concluded by the time that President Xi visits the G20, and it will give us a significant roadmap going forward on even specific investment issues is the intent. But it is aimed at two-way investment. Of course, most attention is on the very significant and very welcome investment from China to Australia over the last 10 to 14 years in particular. But of course Australia has got $20 billion of investment in China, and so much of our potential investment interest is in the services area. And we discussed this at length, and this investment cooperation framework will really put some substance and some real form around investment opportunities both ways, and I think again will add further to the acceleration of the economic relationship between our two countries.
Questions? Over to you. Yes, sir.
Honourable Traveller and Minister, I'm a reporter with China Financial and Economic News. I have two questions to conduct both of you. First question is, as far as I'm concerned, G20 trade minister meeting will be held in Sydney next month. And I want to know what achievements both of you do expect for it, in particular liberalization of trade. And the second question is, led by the Ministry of Finance of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese government is pushing forward the PPP mode. We know that Australia is the advanced country with many years of PPP mode experiences. So I want to know what advice or suggestions will you give for the Chinese counterpart. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, I can answer the second part first, and then if you talk about the G20. I'm meeting with Finance Minister Lo Ji-wei tomorrow, and we have already, on a number of occasions, discussed PPPs. And you're right, Australia is regarded as one of the world's leaders in relation to PPPs. And despite some domestic political challenges, we are determined to roll out further PPPs to build the infrastructure for the 21st century that Australia needs. And we will utilise the trillions of dollars that are going to be in superannuation, but also the huge amount of investable money available out of China to build the infrastructure that is productive and generates income. Now, this is something that is one of the core areas of focus of the G20. How do we get more private sector investment into productive infrastructure? And there are some golden rules in that regard, that you need consistent access regimes, you need to have a regulatory environment that is stable and supportive, you need to have a proper assessment of traffic flows, you need to have a speedy environmental approval, not something that has been a particular impediment in China, but it is hugely important that when you make all the decisions to go ahead with projects, you actually do go ahead with the projects, rather than being bogged down in red tape and disorganised government. So, having said that, we are prepared to work closely with our friends in the Finance Ministry in China to develop PPP, the infrastructure around PPP that helps to bring along speedy investment in infrastructure. And you might talk about G20.
Okay. There is, as you indicated, a T20 meeting on July the 19th in Sydney, and it will be joined by all of the trade ministers, more or less, from all of the G20 countries. It is an input into the G20 meeting later in the year of leaders, and what the G20 meeting later in the year is looking for is each member of the G20 to present a range of domestic initiatives that they will take unilaterally, right? Things that reforms they will take within their own country to contribute to a 2% growth, an increase in 2% growth. Now, we are looking at the T20 at the trade component of those measures, right? So once we come up with those measures, they will go on to the G20 as a contribution towards each country's G20 offering. And I would hope that we see some very ambitious offerings at the T20. One, commitments certainly not to continue the earlier G20 decision to freeze any increases in protection, and a subsequent agreement to begin to roll back any protectionary measures that were introduced after the global financial crisis, where we saw an increase in protection. Right, those two things. Secondly, the trade facilitation agreement that was agreed at the WTO Bali meeting earlier this year, which has the potential to create some 21 million jobs and add $1 trillion to world economic growth, to have that fast-tracked, and for the whole G20 to fast-track that. So they're the key things that we'll be looking to see.
Minister, can you give us an indication of what is, or some more details around what exactly is in this investment cooperation framework that you're planning to sign, and what sort of areas will be canvassed? Is it outside the free trade agreement? Is it sort of consistent with that? And secondly, maybe for the Treasurer, do you get the sense that for Australia to take the sort of trade and economic relationship with China to another level, do you get the sense that China will require a more independent foreign policy from Australia?
In relation to the second issue, no. In relation to the first issue, the investment cooperation framework goes beyond the free trade agreement. It is based out of the strategic economic dialogue, which will be held each year, and I invited Chairman Xu to come to Australia next year for that meeting. The focus is to deepen the everyday engagement between China and Australia with some identifiable projects. Now, for example, we talked at length, as my colleague, the Trade Minister, was able to speak with a great deal of knowledge. We talked at length about the government's Northern Australia White Paper and the massive demand for new investment to develop Northern Australia, and certainly that was something that created a lot of interest with Chairman Xu. So out of our investment cooperation framework, we want some identifiable areas as well where there are going to be new investment opportunities, and it's as much about investment in Australia as it is about Australia investing in China.
So with the actual project, is that right? So could this include like high-speed rail or something?
It could go to... the free trade agreement is about rules, right? So we will hopefully conclude a set of rules that will free up trade between Australia and China on a whole host of issues.
Does this mean...
Hang on, that's the first part of it. This sits along beside it. It takes that expression of goodwill and trust, I think, to a further level where we start to identify potentially individual projects or individual areas where we will give one another particular consideration. So for investment into China and investment from China into Australia. And it did follow a recognition by Chairman Xu that a series of very significant investments in Australia have been quickly and properly considered and approved by the Treasurer over recent months, which showed our bona fides in dealing with things that are materially of interest to Australia, but also benefits investors from China.
And he named the individual investment decisions, so that's quite interesting. It was a detailed discussion.
Which one?
Well, like State Grid and Yancoal, the decision I made in relation to Yancoal, and also a recent decision I made on Bay of Steel.
So with that, in terms of the investment framework that you say is going to be rolled out, will there be a change in attitude from Australia towards state-owned enterprise?
Well, we have changed our attitude. We came with a new government. Obviously, where it is contrary to our national interest, we will say no. But there have been a range of applications that have come before the Foreign Investment Review Board and come to me as Treasurer. They've been approved. So we are open for business. And the fact is, when the Prime Minister said on election night, Australia is open for business, we've been able to add real meaning to those words, and that was recognised by Chairman Xu in his opening statement to us. He recognised, and I say it again, the investment environment in Australia has improved a lot since the election of the new government. His words.
And in terms of you mentioned that he said both countries will acknowledge that it was doable this year in terms of the free trade agreement. Was there any discussion around the specifics of that, or what might hold it up?
Well, I did, which they already knew, I think, but I did go through in broad detail where I'd got to with Minister Cow just on June the 7th, where we met in Canberra. But we've still got a lot of negotiation to do, including around the investment rules that was just referred to. The rules will be set in the free trade agreement. The investment cooperation framework will take that and seek to apply with goodwill an approach to specific areas